An invisible demon is haunting Europe, the demon of communism. All the powers of old Europe have formed an alliance to chase out this demon. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. Where is the underdog political party that has not been labeled communistic by its rivals in power? Where the opposition that has not thrown back the name-calling of communism against its own competitors? Two things happen as a result. One, communism is already treated and realized by all European powers as itself a power. Two, it is time that communists should openly, in front of the whole world, publish their views, their aims, their tendencies, and meet this fairy tale of the demon of communism with a manifesto, a statement of beliefs and goals of the party itself. To this end, communists of various nationalities have assembled in London and made a draft of the following manifesto to be published in the English, French, German, Italian, Flemish, and Danish languages. Chapter 1: Bourgeois and Proletarians. The history of society up until now is the history of struggles between social classes. Free men and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman. In a word, oppressor and oppressed stood in constant fighting against each other, carried on an uninterrupted, sometimes hidden, sometimes open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reorganization of society in general, or in everyone losing. In the earlier periods of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into several sections, all sorts of divisions in wealth and power. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guildmasters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. In almost all of these classes, again, even more specific categories. The modern society that has grown out of the ruins of feudal society has not gotten rid of class rivalry. It has simply established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. Our time period, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, has, however, this distinctive feature. It has simplified the class enemies. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two huge hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other: bourgeoisie and proletariat. From the peasants of the Middle Ages came the contract workers of the earliest towns. From these towns, the first elements of the bourgeoisie were developed. The discovery of America and the first sailing around the Cape opened up fresh grounds for the rising bourgeoisie. The East Indian and Chinese markets, the colonization of America, trade with the colonies, the increase in the ways to go about exchanging goods and services, and in goods in general, gave to commerce, to navigation, to industry, an impulse never before known, and thereby to the revolutionary element in the tottering feudal society, a rapid development. The medieval system of industry, under which industrial production was monopolized by closed guilds, now no longer sufficed for the growing wants of the new markets. The manufacturing system took its place. The guild masters were pushed on one side by the manufacturing middle class. Division of labor between the different corporate guilds vanished when faced with division of labor in each single workshop. Meanwhile, the markets kept growing, the demand always rising. Even the assembly line was no longer enough. As a result, steam and machinery revolutionized industrial production. The place of manufacture was taken by the giant, modern industry. The place of the industrial middle class by industrial millionaires, the leaders of whole industrial armies, the modern bourgeois. Modern industry has established the world market, for which the discovery of America made possible. This market has given a huge development to trade, to navigation, to communication by land. This development has, in its time, depended on industry expanding, and has grown in proportion as industry, commerce, navigation, railways, all extended. In the same proportion, the bourgeoisie developed, increased its resources, and pushed into the background every social class handed down from the Middle Ages. We see, therefore, how the modern bourgeoisie is itself the product of a long history of development, of a series of revolutions in the methods of production and of exchange. Each step in the development of the bourgeoisie was accompanied by a connected political advance of that class, an oppressed class under the rule of the medieval nobility, an armed and self-governing group in the middle town, here independent urban republic, as in Italy and Germany, there taxable third estate of the monarchy, as in France. Afterwards, in the actual period of manufacture, serving either the semi-feudal or the absolute monarchy as a balance against the nobility, and in fact, an essential part of the great monarchies in general, the bourgeoisie has at last, since the establishment of modern industry and of the world market, conquered for itself in the modern representative state exclusive political control. The executive branch of the modern state is simply a committee for managing the shared business of the whole bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie, historically, has played a very revolutionary part. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has gotten the advantage, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has, without mercy, torn apart the various feudal ties that connected man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other connection between man and man than basic self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly joys of religious enthusiasm, of chivalry, of sentiment, in the icy water of self-interested calculation. It has turned personal wealth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless and doable freedoms that were once considered sacred, has set up that single, impossible freedom, free trade. In one word, for exploitation, taking advantage unfairly, poorly hidden by religious and political illusions, naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation once honored and looked up to with reverent respect. It has turned the doctor, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage laborers. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its emotional layer and has reduced the family relation to just a money relation. The bourgeoisie has revealed how it happened that the brutal display of energy in the Middle Ages, which reactionists admire so much, found its suitable partner in the worst laziness. It has been the first to show that man's activity can make happen. It has accomplished wonders even more amazing than Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has sent out expeditions that are even more impressive than all former exoduses of nations and crusades. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the tools of production, and therefore the processes of production, and with them the whole processes of society. Preserving the old method of production in unaltered form was, instead, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, eternal uncertainty and unrest. These distinguish the bourgeois period from all earlier ones. All fixed, frozen relations, with their associations of ancient and esteemed prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All newly formed ones become old-fashioned before they can fossilize. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is made unclean, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given an urban character to production and consumption in every country. To the great distress of reactionists, it has drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which it stood. All old, established national industries have been destroyed, or are daily being destroyed. They are pushed aside by new industries, whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations, by industries that no longer work up local raw material, but raw material drawn from most faraway places. Industries whose products are consumed not only at home, but in every portion of the globe. In place of the old wants, satisfied by the productions of the country, we find new wants, requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climates. In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have interaction in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. And as in material, so also in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible, and from the many national and local literatures, there comes a world literature. The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all tools of production, by the methods of communication being made so much easier, brings all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. The cheap prices of its products are the heavy artillery it uses to batter down all Chinese walls, with which it forces their intense hatred of foreigners to give in. It requires all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It requires them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In short, it creates a world after its own image. The bourgeoisie has put the country under the rule of the towns. It has created enormous cities, has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, and has in this way rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. Just as it has made the country dependent on the towns, So it has made barbarian and semi-barbarian countries dependent on the civilized ones. Nations of peasants on nations of bourgeois, the East on the West. The bourgeoisie keeps more and more elimination of the scattered state of the population, of the means of production, and of property. It is combined production and is concentrated property in a few hands. The necessary consequence of this was political centralization, independent, or but loosely connected provinces with separate interests, laws, governments, and systems of taxation became lumped together into one nation, with one government, one code of laws, one national class interest, one frontier, and one customs tariff. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of barely 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all previous generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam, navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations magically brought out of the ground. What earlier century could even dream that such productive forces slept in the lap of social labor? We see then the means of production and of exchange on whose foundation the bourgeoisie built itself up were generated in feudal society. At a certain stage in the development of these means of production and of exchange, the conditions under which feudal society produced and exchanged, the feudal organization of agriculture and manufacturing, in short, the feudal relations of property became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became like chains. They had to be burst. They were burst. Into their place stepped free competition, accompanied by a social and political constitution adapted to it, and by the economical and political sway of the bourgeois class. A similar movement is going on before our own eyes. Modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has magically created such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the spirit world, whom he is called upon by his spells. For many a decade past, the history of industry and commerce is only the history of the revolt of modern productive forces against modern conditions of production, against the property relations that are the conditions for the existence of the bourgeoisie and of its rule. It is enough to mention the commercial panics that by their periodical return put on its trial, each time more threateningly, the existence of the entire bourgeois society. In these crises, a great part not only of the existing products, but also of the previously created productive forces are periodically destroyed. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that, in all earlier periods of time, would have seemed ridiculous. The epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine or a universal war of devastation had cut off the supply of every way to survive. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? Because there is too much civilization, too many resources, too much industry, too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of bourgeois property. Instead, they have become too powerful for these conditions by which they are chained, and so soon as they overcome these fetters, they bring disorder into the whole of bourgeois society, endanger the existence of bourgeois property. The conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to take in the wealth created by them. And how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On the one hand, enforced destruction of a quantity of productive forces. On the other, by the conquest of new markets, and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for even worse problems and reducing the ability to prevent them. The weapons with which the bourgeoisie toppled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. But not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that bring death to itself, it has also called into existence the men who are to wield those weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians. In proportion as the bourgeoisie, i.e. capital, is developed, in the same proportion as the proletariat, the modern working class, developed. A class of laborers who live only as long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. These laborers, who must sell themselves piece by piece, are a product, like every other item of commerce, and are because of this exposed to all the ups and downs of competition, to all the unreliability of the market. Owing to all the use of machinery and division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character, and consequently, all enjoyment for the workman. He becomes a limb of the machine, and it is only the most simple, most boring, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. So the cost of production of a worker is restricted, almost entirely, to the subsistence that he requires for his maintenance and for the propagation of his race. But the price of a commodity, and therefore also of labor, is equal to its cost of production. In proportion, therefore, as the awfulness of the work increases, the wage decreases. In proportion as the use of machinery and division of labor increases, in the same proportion, the burden of work also increases, whether by lengthening of the working hours, by increase of the work in a given time, or by increased speed of the machinery, etc. Modern industry has converted the little workshop of the fatherly master into the great factory of the industrial capitalist. Large groups of laborers crowded into the factory are organized like soldiers. As privates of the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class and of the bourgeois state, they are every day and every hour enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker, and above all by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. The more openly this tyranny announces that personal gain to be its end and aim, the more petty, the more hateful, and the more depressing it is. The less the skill and use of strength is required in manual labor. In other words, the more modern industry becomes developed, the more is the labor of men replaced by that of women. Differences of age and sex have no longer any distinctive social meaning for the working class. All are instruments of labor, more or less expensive to use, according to their age and sex. No sooner is the exploitation of the laborer by the manufacturer so far at an end that he receives his wages in cash, than he is taken advantage of by the other portions of the bourgeoisie, the landlord, the shopkeeper, the pawnbroker, etc. The lower levels of the middle class, the small tradespeople, shopkeepers, retired tradesmen, generally the handicraftsmen and peasants, all these sink gradually into the proletariat, partly because their small amount of capital is not enough for the scale on which modern industry is carried on, and is swamped in the competition with the large capitalists, partly because their specialized skill is made worthless by the new methods of production. In this way, the proletariat is recruited from all classes of the population. The proletariat goes through various stages of development. With its birth begins its struggle with the bourgeoisie. At first, the contest is carried on by individual laborers, then by the work people of a factory, then by the leaders of one trade in one location against the individual bourgeois who directly exploits them. They direct their attacks not against the bourgeois conditions of production, but against the tools of production themselves. They destroy imported goods that compete with their labor. They smash to pieces machinery. They set factories on fire. They try to restore by force the now gone status of the workers of the Middle Ages. At this stage, the laborers still form an unorganized mass scattered over the whole country and broken up by their mutual competition. If they unite anywhere to form more compact groups, this is not yet the consequence of their own actions, but of the union of the bourgeoisie, which in order to achieve its own political ends must set the whole proletariat in motion, and is also still able to do so. At this stage, therefore, the proletarians do not fight their enemies, but the enemies of their enemies. What still remains of absolute monarchy? The landowners, non-industrial bourgeois, the unimportant bourgeoisie. In this way, the whole historical movement is concentrated in the hands of the bourgeoisie. Every victory the proletariat gets is a victory for the bourgeoisie. But with the development of industry, the proletariat not only increases its number, it becomes more and more concentrated together. Its strength grows, and it feels that strength more. The various interests and conditions of life within the ranks of the proletariat are made more and more equal, in proportion as machinery gets rid of all distinctions of labor, and nearly everywhere reduces wages to the same low level. The growing competition among the bourgeois and the resulting commercial crises make the wages of the workers even more unreliable. The constant improvement of machinery, always more rapidly developing, makes their livelihood more and more likely to become impossible. The collisions between individual workmen and individual bourgeois become more and more like collisions between two classes. So the workers begin to form combinations, trade unions, against the bourgeois. They join together in order to keep up the rate of wages. They establish permanent associations in order to prepare for occasional rebellions. Here and there, the contest breaks out into riots. Now and then, the workers are victorious, but only for a time. The real result of their battles lies not in the immediate result, but in the always expanding union of the workers. This union is helped on by the improved ways of communication that are created by modern industry and that place the workers of different locations the workers of different localities in contact with one another. It was just this contact that was needed to centralize the many local struggles, all of the same type, into one national struggle between classes. But every class struggle is a political struggle, and that union, to manage what the middle class of the Middle Ages, with their puny highways, required centuries. The modern proletarians, thanks to railways, achieve in just a few years. This organization of the proletarians into a class and so into a political party, is always being upset again by the competition between the workers themselves. But it always rises up again, stronger, firmer, mightier. It forces legislative recognition of particular interests of the workers. It forces legislative recognition of particular interests of the workers by taking advantage of the divisions among the bourgeoisie itself. This is how the 10 Hours Bill in England was carried. The collisions between the classes of the old society further, in many ways, the course of development of the proletariat. The bourgeoisie finds itself involved in a constant battle, at first with the aristocracy, later on with those portions of the bourgeoisie itself, whose interests have become opposed to the progress of industry. At all times with the bourgeoisie of foreign countries. In all these battles, it sees itself forced to become appealing to the proletariat, to ask for its help, and in this way to drag it into the political arena. The bourgeoisie itself, therefore, provides the proletariat with weapons for fighting the bourgeoisie. Further, as we have already seen, entire sections of the ruling classes are, by the advance of industry, brought into the proletariat, or are at least threatened in their conditions of existence. They are also supplying the proletariat with new elements of knowledge and progress. Finally, in times when the class struggle comes close to the most important times, the process of dissolving going on within the ruling class, in fact, within the whole range of society, takes on such a violent, obvious character that a small section of the ruling class cuts itself free and joins the revolutionary class, the class that holds the future in its hands. Just as at an earlier period, a section of the nobility went over to the bourgeoisie, so now a portion of the bourgeoisie goes over to the proletariat, and in particular, a portion of the bourgeois intellectuals who have raised themselves to the level of understanding the historical movement as a whole. Of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie today, the proletariat alone is a really revolutionary class. The other classes decay and finally disappear in the face of modern industry. The proletariat is its special and essential product. The lower middle class, the small manufacturer, the shopkeeper, the artisan, the peasant, all these fight against the bourgeoisie to save from extinction their existence as fractions of the middle class. They are, therefore, not revolutionary, but conservative. Actually, they are reactionary, for they try to roll back the wheel of history. If by chance they are revolutionary, they are only that way because of their future transfer into the proletariat, defending not their present, but their future interests. They leave their own standpoint to place themselves at that of the proletariat. The dangerous class, the social scum, that rotting mass thrown off by the lowest layers of old society, may here and there be swept into the movement by a proletarian revolution. Its conditions of life, however, make it more likely to be easily bribed by the reactionaries. In the conditions of the proletariat, those of old society at large are already virtually swamped. The proletarian has no property. His relationships with his wife and children has no longer anything in common with the bourgeois family relations, modern industrial labor, modern subjection to capital. The same in England as in France, in America as in Germany, has taken away from him every hint of national character. Law, morality, religion, these are to him just bourgeois prejudices behind which wait in ambush just as many bourgeois interests. All the previous classes that got the advantage tried to strengthen their already acquired status by subjecting society in general to their conditions. The proletarians cannot become masters of the productive forces of society except by getting rid of their own former ways of getting things, and thereby also every other way of getting things. They have nothing of their own to strengthen and keep safe. Their mission is to destroy the concept of individual property. All previous historical movements were movements of minorities, or in the interests of minorities. The proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority, in the interests of the immense majority. The proletariat, the lowest level of our current society, cannot stir, cannot raise itself up without all the other layers of official society crumbling. The struggle of the proletariat with the bourgeoisie is at first a national struggle. The proletariat of each country must, of course, first of all settle matters with its own bourgeoisie. In depicting the most general phases of the development of the proletariat, we trace the more or less disguised civil war raging within existing society up to the point where that war breaks out into open revolution, and where the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie lays the foundation for the rule of the proletariat. Up until now, every form of society has been based, as we have already seen, on the fighting between oppressing and oppressed classes. But in order to oppress a class, certain conditions must be assured to it under which it can, at least, continue its slave-like existence. The serf, in the period of serfdom, raised himself to membership in the commune, just as the petty bourgeois, in the chains of feudal absolutism, managed to develop into a real bourgeois. The modern laborer, though instead of rising with the progress of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class. He becomes desperately poor, and poverty develops more rapidly than population and wealth. And here it becomes obvious that the bourgeoisie is no longer capable of being the ruling class in society and to force its conditions of existence upon society as an overriding law. It is unfit to rule because it is unable to promise an existence to its slave within his slavery, because it cannot help letting him sink into such a situation that it has to feed him instead of being fed by him. Society can no longer live under this bourgeoisie. In other words, its existence is no longer compatible with society. The essential condition for the existence and for the rule of the bourgeois class is the creation and increasing of capital. The condition for capital is wage labor. Wage labor depends entirely on competition between the laborers. The advance of industry, whose helpless promoter is the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of the laborers due to competition by the revolutionary combination, due to association. The development of modern industry, therefore, cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all is its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable.